Hey, everybody, this is Chuck Marohn. Welcome back to the Strong Towns podcast. I was on a bit of a vacation last month, and as I was out, I try to stay away from the news. I try not to wreck my family's time with me by following too closely, but it was hard not to see. It was hard not to watch what was going on in Maui and the destruction of, a major part of this beautiful island, this kind of paradise that I've been fortunate enough to visit Hawaii and been amazed by the beauty. As I'm looking at this, it occurs to me that there's a standard playbook for places going through distress like this. There's a standard playbook for how we, in a sense, assist from the top down places that have gone through destruction like this. And it's different than what I have seen work and what I have talked to people about that have been there and experienced this. And so when I got back, one of the first things I did is ask my friend Steve Mouzon if he would be willing to come on and chat a little bit about some of his experiences. You may know Steve. He's been on the podcast a few times. He's the author of The Original Green, amongst other things, but The Original Green is the book that I quote most often. It's one of my top 5 Strong Towns books, so you have to read it. Steve's on our advisory board, and he's just a good friend. So, Steve, welcome to the Strong Towns podcast.
Thanks so much for having me on. I really appreciate that. It's always a pleasure, and I always learn a lot visiting with you for an hour.
Well, you and I did not coordinate this, but we're both, for those that are seeing the video, we're both wearing white today, and you're like a customary wearing black guy. So I got on here and we're like twinsies all of a sudden.
Yeah, it's what you do in the summer in a place where it's hot. And I'm in Tuscaloosa, and it's been close to 100 for weeks on end. And so, yeah, you stay cooler if you want to go out for a walk this way than all black like I would in the wintertime.
Well, you look good, man.
Thank you, man.
I want to. There's 3 kind of different things I want to hit on. And I just want to tee you up and let you talk a little bit about this. One of the earliest things that I came across you doing that really struck me as profound was some of the work you did, and I believe it was in Haiti, after a hurricane had struck in Haiti. And some of this involved, helping teach people building codes, and some of it involved putting together new living units. I know there were a lot of people involved in this, but you were one. Can you talk just a little bit about the experience in Haiti and maybe some of the lessons? And I'll interrupt you with some questions as we go, but can you just start there? Because I feel like there's a lot of profound things that happened in your work in Haiti.
Sure. And actually I was not one of the ones on the ground there. I was involved from afar. In Andres Duani and the Princess Foundation was involved. There were a few people on the ground, but I was not one of them. Now there was also a recovery effort from economic recovery, where the place was just incredibly poor. That was in Jamaica, that I was involved also with the Princess Foundation and with
I might be getting these 2 mixed up, because I know the Jamaica one's the one where you help them write the codes into song on the
Yes.
walls and stuff, right?
Well, yeah. Actually, the children did that. What actually happened was that in this place, which is it's called Rosetown. It's right next to Trenchtown. Which is more famous because of songs of a different nature. But anyhow, the in Rosetown, this was a community of several thousand people that had gotten they had literally civil war back in the 60s, and in their case, the Red Party was in the north, and the Blue Party, I'm not making this up, but that's their adopted colors. The Blue Party was in the south, and the fighting was so fierce that the government just bulldozed out the heart of the neighborhood, and so it's kind of no man's land. And so when now King Charles, when he was prince, came to see the place, he said, we absolutely must do something to help this place recover. And so that's how that charrette came about. Well, there were actually two charrettes. The first one Andres was involved with. The second was just straight up Princess Foundation. But anyhow, on the second one, Mike Watkins was the one leading that charrette. And in that one, and Hank Dittmar was the one that was involved in Haiti with Andres. But anyhow, so the second one, my job was coding the recovery of the architecture, because what had happened was, it is that if you go back 100 years and you look at the grandparents or great grandparents of the people living there now in abject poverty, what their great grandparents or great grandparents built was perfectly competent tropical architecture, following ancient patterns and all this. And the people that were living there when we came were literally, most of them were living out under the sky. They had no roof over their heads. What they would do is they would scavenge roof panels that had been blown off, corrugated metal, and they would first of all make a perimeter around their little piece of. Nobody owned anything. The government did not allow people to buy a place, so they were just simply camping out on the ground, and but without a roof over their heads. And so we were trying to reinfuse the place with what their grandparents and great grandparents knew about how you best live in a tropical climate that has heat and humidity and hurricanes. And so I spent most of the week sitting there and trying to concoct the code. But then it occurred to me, this place there are 3 flush toilets in the entire neighborhood. Everything else is open latrines. And I'm from the Deep South. I'm from Alabama originally. And when I was a teenager growing up, a lot of my mother's family in Kentucky and a lot of Wanda's family in North Alabama did not yet have running water in their houses. And so they would have outhouses, for example. And so when people were poor like that, I knew what happened to the Sears catalog. Nobody bought TP. It was
right.
Sears catalog. It's just what they use.
I grew up on a farm in a poor place, and we had an outhouse as well. Now we did have running water by the time we bought the farmhouse and moved in, but I know exactly what you mean when you say that.
Yeah. So it occurred to me that as soon as I realized that, it instantly occurred to me that a written code, even if only 20, 30 pages, every copy would be gone in less than a week.
Yeah, it's going to get
be used for necessary things.
Yeah. There's more urgent things.
Right, exactly. And so what I did was that, because I've been noticing all through the neighborhood that on these scavenged corrugated metal walls or barricades around a piece of land where the people slept, they would, even in abject poverty, where these people are hungry poor and not just economically disadvantaged, and so but even in spite of that, they would go around and paint. This was not graffiti. This was carefully hand lettered. They would paint proverbs on the wall. In some cases, it was literally biblical proverbs. In other cases, it was just advice on how to live a better life. Many things like that. And I thought, well, I should do what the people do, and turn all of these code items into proverbs, each one of them, and then we'll begin to write them on the walls like the people do. That's the local vernacular.
To share wisdom. Yeah,
exactly. And so on the last day of the charrette, there was one woman from on the team from from I think London, somewhere in the UK, and so anyhow, and she had a good hand at painting, and so she took one of the proverbs, which said to plant your yard with things you can eat, for why should your yard lay fallow while you spend more of your money at the grocery store? You know, and
Great,
why
great
shouldn't you
advice.
raise more food, and instead of spending every last penny at you know, buying groceries? And so she got that painted on the wall by the end of the day, and then we had the final presentation. It was in an abandoned house that Prince Charles had bought and made it the neighborhood library, and so that was a part of the redevelopment of the place. And so we had the, you know, the final presentation, and at the end, the people were sitting around visiting, and one young architect from Kingston, not in that neighborhood, but he was another part of Kingston, but he was heavily involved in the project. He came to me and grabbed me by the elbow, and he said, "Steve, come here. You got to see this." I said, "What is it?" He said, "Just follow me." So I followed him out into the night, and I could hear them. It was the voices of little children singing. They were taking those words on the wall that were never meant to have rhythm or rhyme, and they were turning them into a song. Now, we can't do that. All we can do is set the stage for things like that to happen, where people pick up something and make it their own. And so that was a huge lesson, being in.
It's beautiful.
Yeah, how you really have to, you know, it has to be something that should be a key to recovery of any place from whatever the disaster is. How do you help the people make it their own?
So I want to poke a little bit at original green wisdom in this story, because you described people who were living open air, like under the stars, despite the fact that their ancestors, right? Same, let me say it this way, same geography, same place, same culture, same people, but just I'll say a different economic system, or a different time, or a different kind of governmental surroundings. We're living a much lower standard of living, despite our affluence, despite our technology, despite our capacity. How does something like this, you're describing something that feels like a natural disaster, but as you described it, you know, the red and the blue and the the warring factions and all that, was this a byproduct of that dispute, or was this a byproduct of just modernity kicking a certain group of people to the curb? Like what was the actual kind of underlying, you think, cause of this distress?
You know, I know just enough about it to be dangerous, and
Yeah.
so probably anything I would tell you would not be entirely accurate. But what I think there was my perception was that there was and I don't even know what year it happened. I know in the Bahamas it was 1973, I believe, but I don't know what year that Jamaica gained their actual independence. But it seemed like there was inherent instability resulting from the fact that what had been the kind of the governmental rock, that for better for worse was the authorities were now gone, and so it was not like the people had a 10-year period of time or 20 years or whatever to kind of ease into this. It was just my understanding, and it could be everything I'm saying is suspect. Okay,
Sure.
but from what I can tell, that it just was an unsteadiness in that era that led to some pretty difficult circumstances for some time, and so really it was when all the authorities pick up and leave, including the authorities about how to build, you know,
Right.
there's no colonial powers anymore, then, there's a great loss of wisdom. I know that, for example, if you talk to San Antonio, he will tell you, but he's from the Philippines originally, and he would talk about how the original colonial power there would they the people didn't even learn the language, during all those years. It was sort of like, well, only the overlords have the language, and then the people don't. And so it's easy to see how a lot of wisdom about how to do things well would be lost. Now in Jamaica, that didn't happen, because everyone there that I met anyway speaks English, and so that was, it's not the same story, but there are similarities when the colonials pull out and leave the people, so it was very much a loss of wisdom.
It seems a little bit, and let me restate what you just said, because I do, and I mean, reading your work, I feel like one of the deepest insights that you have in the original green and kind of everything that's flowed out of that is that, if we went to a place like Jamaica, we go to a place like the Bahamas, we go to a place like Haiti, we go to a place like Minnesota, where I'm at, there's a certain cultural wisdom that resides by the nature of people having lived there and survived there, and in a sense inherited from the school of hard knocks, maybe is what we'd say, in present, but inherited a certain wisdom that just comes from, time and experience. And one of the things that I picked up on from, hearing that story of Jamaica earlier was that a lot of that kind of localized wisdom had maybe been, in a sense, replaced with, if we want to say, colonial wisdom, or, modern wisdom, or here's like a better way to do things. And the reality is that when you went in there, and some of the teams that had been working in places like Haiti actually tried to get back to what actually works in a place like this, because the kind of homes you would build in Jamaica are going to be different in significant ways than the homes you would build in Tuscaloosa, and the homes you would build in Minnesota, and the homes you would build in other places, simply because, that is what's required to actually thrive there. Steve lost his internet, and so he's tethering on his phone. So we're going to go audio only for the rest of this, and hopefully that works. Steve, when we left off, I was asking you a question about to get to that original green, and I think the thing I was getting at, you used you talked a little bit about colonialism, and I wanted to kind of help you make the point, and they'll cut this part out because I asked the question in a good way before I hit pause. I was trying to get to this notion that the people who lived in, say, Jamaica early on had wisdom that they had received about how to build. And part of that wisdom involved surviving hurricanes and surviving their climate and thriving. And a lot of the let's say, quote unquote, advice that they were given in a more modern era was to build things in a way that didn't necessarily respect the local conditions, let alone the local culture. And I was going to have you like to respond to that and to give any insights you had on that, because it seemed to me that part of the problem you're struggling to overcome was the fact that, a lot of what had been given to modern people was modern ideas that didn't necessarily respect the place or the people.
Yeah, and there were two just absolutely iconic sides to that story, and one is when we went to the neighboring neighborhood which was Trenchtown of Bob Marley fame. And we went into it was a compound that I think his grandparents had built, or maybe great grandparents, I'm not sure. But anyhow, that within this compound, which was a perfectly competent masonry tropical building or set of buildings with a courtyard in the middle. Within the courtyard, they had built in more recent times a shed to shelter Marley's iconic VW bus, in which he had toured apparently. But the shed, the competence with which that shed had been built, just paled in comparison. It looked like something completely rustic compared to what his grandparents had built, sitting side by side. I mean, it's literally, I mean, I could almost touch both the corner post of the shed and also the surrounding building at the same time. I mean, they were just that close together. And so that was just it was a shockingly strong indicator. The other thing was that the government had come in right beside Rosetown, had bulldozed a bunch of the shantytown, and had built a modern housing, low-income housing development, and which was perfectly decent in terms of, I mean, it wasn't like hideously ugly like some of the stuff that we would do in the U.S. or whatever, but in the 3 or 4 years that it had been before the charrette, from when it was built, not one single family from the neighborhood moved into this place that had running water and had toilets and all this kind of thing, had showers. It just, because it was completely foreign, and so so when the people were sold or attempted to be sold on all of the modern ways of doing things, which has less to do with what you do for yourself and more to do with what the government can do for you or to you, as the case may be, or that the industrial development complex wants to sell you things, then it just was not something that was, I'm going to say it wasn't embraced, it was totally rejected, and I've never seen two stronger indicators of the current, at that time, state of affairs is those two buildings.
Let's go to Katrina. I remember, I want to say Katrina was 2003, wasn't it? It was
2005, actually.
Was it really?
Yeah.
Oh my gosh. Okay, 2005. I remember watching this develop and thinking, like the odds of a hurricane in any given year, a Category 5, striking New Orleans is pretty remote, but the odds of it happening in one of our lifetimes is very high. It's one of these things that statistically is kind of inevitable. And it occurred to me, and I feel like this was reinforced later with what happened, was that there's got to be, in a sense, received wisdom on how to deal with and recover from a situation like this. But that modern building, in a sense, like post-war building in a place like New Orleans, would handle that in a completely different way, a way that would stress, in a sense, more padding and armor and thickness and brute strength, as opposed to a kind of adaptable resilience.
Well, there was one building in New Orleans that was that striking to me as well. There, and it's a historic building from, I don't know, close to 200 years ago. I think it was early 19th century, I believe. It's called the Pitot House, Pitot, and it was up near Lake Pontchartrain. It was not anywhere near the French Quarter or anything. And what happened there is it was built the old way, which is you build your first floor walls of masonry and you stucco them, and then you build the second floor with wood structure. And so what happened when the hurricane was on the way, they didn't know what was going to happen at that time. They didn't know the levees would break or anything. It was kind of out of people's minds, I guess. But
Right.
they simply took all the furniture from the first floor, moved it up to the second floor.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, the levees
Mm-hmm.
did break. The place flooded, up to the bottom of the second floor structure almost. As it did with buildings all around, and all the wood frame newer buildings that had not been built the old ways. They all had to be bulldozed because they were filled with mold and mildew, and the wood was rotten and all this, and so it just, I mean, they were total losses. They were some of the 250,000 houses that roughly that were lost in the New Orleans metro area with Katrina. And with the Pateau House, they simply went in there, hosed out the walls and the floor of the first floor, brought all the furniture back down, and they were good.
Yeah.
It
Yeah.
just was a shocking difference in what the old wisdom will do for you, and what the new products. If we buy a product from the industrial development complex, whether that product be a house or whatever, a piece of a house or whatever it is, that's just something that you buy. And this term about you know a smart dwelling, or a smart this and smart that, is all what is meant to be, is allow the humans to be dumb. You don't have to think. You don't need
Right.
any wisdom
Yeah.
of how to do things well if you buy supposedly smart stuff. But if the smartness is all having to do with just the delivery process, and not the real deep needs of humanity, then that in tough situations, then it may be smart in that sense, but it's certainly not strong.
Or adaptable. Right. Yeah.
Exactly.
I'm interested from you in the response to Katrina. And this was 18 years ago. I'm
Yes.
guessing that there are plenty of people in our audience who don't have the vivid recollections of Katrina that you and I do. I remember watching this horror kind of unfold slowly in front of us. A hurricane come in, and then the levees and dikes breaking, and then this mass of humanity fleeing to a domed stadium in the middle of the city, and nobody going to help them. And I remember feeling just this helplessness. There was a response though, and I think you experienced the good and the bad about the response. Can you talk a little bit about, and maybe we should start with the critical part. Can you talk a little bit about what about the response didn't work? And then I'd like to talk a little bit about some of the lessons and things that we did see working there.
Yeah. Well, the part of the response that didn't work, is that, and it's what happens so very often on in a disaster prone place like the Gulf Coast, and that is that there are a certain number of locals that always are going to say, well, we'll just ride it out. We did it before, we can do it again. And there should never have been anywhere near that number of people in the Superdome. They should have left town. And so, as a matter of fact, I've got family friends that were on some of the crews. I was in Miami at the time, of course, but that were on some of the crews that were cutting their way to the coast. And
Yeah.
but when you start in Jackson with chainsaws, and you're trying to cut your way to New Orleans, it takes, it took them basically a week to get there, because you got every down tree across the road, that's just the beginning of your troubles. I mean, and so had had there been a lot fewer people there, where you could just airlift some things in, that would have been one thing. But it was just the sheer volume that was a huge issue of what did not work. And so that was the number one key of all things, is just simply the fact that the people themselves should have, the mayor said, he said, this is the one we have long feared.
Yeah.
And but that didn't seem to there were just way too many people that didn't heed the warning and leave town.
When FEMA,
there's always people like in hospitals and stuff, and that have physical problems, health problems, that they can't just pick up and leave. They can't just jump in a car. A lot of them didn't have a car, so it's not like everybody made that choice. Some people had no choice.
Right. When FEMA came in, I know that you have the enduring kind of meme of, hey, good job, Brownie. And, the critique of George W. Bush and the response. I think it's fair to say, in 18-year hindsight, that this was not a proud moment for the emergency management people. This is almost a case study, it feels like, in poor response. I want to key in a little bit, and you feel free to disagree with that. I mean, I think you were closer to it than me, but I'm wondering if we could talk a little bit about what was done for shelter for people, because I know some of the emergency response stuff was delayed and haphazard and not well executed. But when it ultimately came into place, some of the early stuff was really, I mean, my recollection is that a lot of this was very toxic, and it took people intervening in a different way to move it to something else. Can you talk about those early shelter and recovery efforts?
Yes, exactly. As a matter of fact, on the Friday after the hurricane, I went over to DPZ. There was, at that time, there was a group in Baton Rouge that said, we can house a lot of people here fairly quickly. Will you come and help us with that? And so I said, well, that's way too big for me. Let me go over and talk to Andres. And then so he, when I presented the idea to him, he said, well, let's call up the CEO of the Congress for Urbanism and get the CNU involved. And so and it turned out that within 6 weeks of the hurricane, we had actually assembled the largest planning event probably in human history. There were almost 200 professionals in the rooms where the charrette was held, or as it was called, the Mississippi Renewal Forum. And so that was a good thing. Then the next day after that Friday, I came back to DPZ, and that's when Andres said, he said, Steve, it was 13 years ago was Andrew, and at that time FEMA brought some trailers in for people to live in as very temporary housing, and he said there are kids that begin kindergarten in that FEMA trailer and graduated from high school still living in that FEMA trailer, and he said, in in the New Orleans area, the local building community had built only about 1,000 houses a year for the last 2-3 decades, something like that. But with 250,000 houses lost, then it would take 250 years at that rate to rebuild what had been lost. And so he said, we got to find some way that we can rebuild in a number of ways, not just conventional construction. We need every method in play. We need manufactured housing, we need modular housing, we need panelized housing, and we need conventional construction to have any chance of doing any good in our lifetimes. But he also said, your number one job in this that I'd really like you to take on is the most important thing. He said, right now, we don't have any idea what FEMA is planning to bring in this time. It could be something totally different. You need to do all the research you can to find out what it is and to see how much they're spending and to see if we can do better. And so that's where that Saturday was where the original idea of the FEMA trailers, excuse me, of the Katrina cottages came from as a replacement for FEMA trailers. And so we conceived of that on that day is emergency housing with dignity, because the FEMA trailers had none, and so that was a part of the thing of how can you help your place recover, feeling like you're actually human and not just a cog in a machine. You see what I mean?
No, I totally see. Talk a little bit about what is unique about a Katrina cottage as opposed to your standard FEMA trailer.
Well, there were, we had several ideas in mind about that. And one of them is that it should be something that would let you get the tiniest bit of foothold, kind of a beachhead, if you want to use a military term, on your land again. And there were in Mississippi and in Louisiana, there was a lot of gallows humor, things like, well, I'm a proud slab owner in Pass Christian or whatever, because that's all that was left slab,
right?
And so
I love people. I really do.
Yeah, it's humans have got to you got to have fun with something, even in the direst of circumstances, and they were certainly doing that. And these were people living in tents months after the storm, so they didn't even have anything hard. They had canvas all around them, and that was it. But so the idea is how can you build something incredibly small, nowhere like what had been lost. Even a shotgun house in New Orleans was like 3 or 4 times the size of a Katrina cottage. But the idea being is, how can you gain this foothold where you and your family can get back onto what you're paying, because you're paying a mortgage payment on a house that doesn't exist anymore. And it was taking, a year and a half, 2 years for the insurance companies to get in and actually reach settlements. I remember one sign that a slab owner had put up. I think it was either Waveland or Pass Christian, one of the two. And he said, Katrina, on the sign, Katrina, work of God. In insurance companies, he named one of them, but anyhow, the work of the devil.
Yeah.
That was kind of the way that it came out. But anyhow, so if you can get a tiny foothold on your land again, and then if the cottage is smart enough that it has obvious ways to expand, ideally what would happen is it would become kind of a granny cottage in the backyard or something like that, or it could be a home office. It could be, it could do a lot of different things, by even though it was small. Matter of fact, the virtue of being very small is that it can be dedicated to almost innumerable things, over time, once you've recovered from the storm. And so that was the idea, is to live with dignity in something incredibly small, that then can expand into what would serve you well in the long run. Tight quarters in the beginning. Think of it like going camping, a little camper trailer or something like that. We lived in a camper trailer for over a year as we're finishing our house that we built back in the 80s. And and the funny thing is, we had actually borrowed that camper trailer from Wanda's family and gone on an anniversary weekend trip, and it was a romantic getaway.
Right.
But a year and a half in it, it was no longer romantic.
A little bit less romantic. Yeah. Well, right. I remember. Go ahead, Steve.
No, I was just going to say, so at some point you got to start occupying more of the land, but at least if you can get that foothold, that was the was a real key, and a foothold with dignity. That was the key in the beginning.
I feel like there's also something about economics here. I remember Andres giving a talk that I heard, and this is, me in the transition from engineer and planner to strong towns advocate. So I was tuning in and asking a lot of questions, and I remember his talk wounded me a little bit because he talked about the recovery, and he actually said this. He goes, the FEMA assumes that everybody in New Orleans wants to live like they're from Minnesota. And he actually used Minnesota as an example. And I think he used it as like, upright, very serious 9 to 5. And he actually described that. And he said that, they believe that everybody wants a 9 to 5 job and everybody wants to have a mortgage. And that, if we go in and pay them fair market value for their property, that they will then, turn around and rebuild. And he said that is not the culture of New Orleans. And then he did this discussion about New Orleans culture. And he said, how do you think you come up with these exotic foods? He said, it's because you spend 14 hours a day cooking exotic foods. He goes, how do you think you come up with beautiful jazz music? It's because you spend a lot of time doing it. And he described the culture of New Orleans as being a culture of leisure. And that struck me as profound because we celebrate New Orleans as this unique place. And I think one of the things that people feared would be lost was this unique New Orleans culture because, the FEMA approach was, well, you've got an old house in New Orleans, it's worth $60,000. We'll come in and be very generous and give you $70,000 for it. And then you go rebuild your life. And when you go price what a new house constructed on your same lot would be, it's 300,000.
Right.
And so, making you whole, quote unquote, making you whole, didn't really do anything for you. It actually required you to live a different life. In Andre's terms, the life of a Minnesotan. Go out and build a $300,000 house now and have a 30-year mortgage and have a 9 to 5 job. And that was not, let's just say, native to that place in an authentic way. Have I lost something here? Am I understanding correctly?
You are that is a very accurate reporting of what he said. Actually, I've heard him say that many times, and I'm convinced that he's exactly correct. And there's something here I'm going to throw in that if you want to talk about it on another podcast someday, I'm going to do a very quick summary of it. But Wanda and I have been working with L.C. Clemens, the artist formerly known as Laura, who is a disaster recovery expert, and on several things that began began several years ago. But the Dorian hurricane, which actually was a tornado that 220 mile an hour winds sat on Marsh Harbor for 2 days. I mean, it's a storm unprecedented in modern history. It's just like, it was unthinkable. And so we've been thinking through a whole lot of things about disaster recovery, but that also applies to sprawl recovery, also applies to recovery from serious disinvestment. And it also applies to the recovery of community of people that leaving one place because of climate change and that are going to some other place to try to rebuild their life again. So a lot of the principles apply across all 4 types of recoveries. But in terms of, in particular, the disaster recovery, when you have lost everything, like the proud slab owners did, then it is, and FEMA sees it in terms of just the recovery of infrastructure in buildings, and that's it. That's not it at all. That's a piece of it, but that's about 1/3 of the equation. The other 2/3 are things that you mentioned in the last couple of minutes, and one of them is, how do you begin to recover an actual economy in this place when literally all of the dollars might be washed out to sea, as in the case of Marsh Harbor. There was just nothing left. But that's not enough either. The other third of the equation is another thing you just mentioned, and that is, how do you begin to, at the earliest possible moment, begin to recover the culture of the place?
Yeah.
So like there should be one place as soon as possible, and several phases of that we didn't understand any of these phases. The first is just when the Red Cross tents show up, and then there's a couple of the phases, and then there's one where the hammers show up, meaning that you're actually starting to build stuff again. And we're in the process of kind of illustrating this for the various recovery types, but that really should be a whole nother topic for a whole nother day. But I just wanted to throw that in because you and I have never talked about that work before. This is something that LC and Wanda and I have been working on kind of quietly for the time being.
Yeah. Well, it feels like, if you live in a place where you have inherited your home, or your home is part of a family legacy, and you've built up this wealth that you measure not only in the value of that structure, but in the value of the connections and the neighborhood and the culture and the people and the place. Any response that comes in and puts down a trailer and walks away and hands you a check is going to be wholly inadequate. I feel like the Katrina cottage, it's maybe not a solution that makes everything whole, but at least gives you a path to start with, as you say, dignity, and then ultimately build to something better over time. Am I being too Pollyanna with this, or is that kind of the vision?
No, that is quite the vision, because anything. And unfortunately, this is the modern world we live in, where we try to put everything in terms of what is the transaction, where it's all transactional. Mm-hmm. That's it. And like you said, you write the check, you drop the dwelling, and you're done. If you're FEMA, and that's a bit oversimplified, but not entirely. And so it is. But yeah, I mean, there's just these other aspects to it, that you're not making someone whole again just by simply writing a check and dropping some hard goods.
Can I offer one more thing? And I'd like your reaction to this, because I was able to, my wife won a journalism award a couple years after Katrina, and the award ceremony was in New Orleans, and it had been a while since I had been. And I said, I really want to go. I haven't seen it post Katrina. I really want to go and experience that. And it was kind of fun, because they had a tour there for journalists to tour the basically the Army Corps of Engineers rebuilding of the dikes and the levees and all the stuff. And so she signed me up for it. Like I got to go on this with a bunch of journalists. They didn't know anything about engineering, right? Like they were asking, I'll say this in all kindness, they were asking like dumb questions. And I was able to kind of get the engineer on the side and say, okay, explain to me what I'm looking at. I'm looking at this massive, and he was very proud of, all this stuff and the different systems they have been putting in place. It was billions of dollars.
Right.
It was a massive sum of money. And I looked at this, and it was hard for me to not see it in terms of, we're not going to spend money helping people recover, or helping neighborhoods reconstitute themselves, or helping people put things back together, or even helping places be more resilient. I mean, we'll go back to the Pito place you talked about at the beginning, where like, can we build in a way that can withstand, once every 100 years getting hit by this? Instead, we're going to build something really, really huge in, kind of the false hope that this will never happen again. Or if it does, we'll be more hardened against it. I felt this sense of bewilderment about it, kind of almost like loss. Like this was this was an unfair response for the people that were there.
Well, and here's the thing too, and that is that, and I keep running across these pieces that I read that just gets me totally incensed. It talks about hurricane-proof construction. There is
Yeah.
no such thing. It does not exist. It's like, and because here's the thing, that which we have not yet seen is greater than that which we have seen. That's just a
Yeah.
fact of life. In the course of a lifetime, the big things ahead are guaranteed, because there's a lot more time ahead, not necessarily for us, but for existence. There's a lot more time ahead than there is of what has happened so far in our lifetime, and so to have the arrogance to think that we can engineer for Katrina and that everything's going to be fine forevermore, happy ever after, is just, that's hubris incarnate.
Well, and let me add on to that. I feel like when we do that, what happens then is we forget, right?
Right.
I go back to the kids with the stuff on the wall, like 30 years from now, will we still be maintaining these massive dikes that need constant maintenance and need perpetual maintenance? Or we just assume that, we've spent billions of dollars and we forget? Because that's actually what happened to the dikes that failed, right? I mean, it's not that they weren't built big enough or strong enough or tall enough. It's just that we forgot about them and we didn't maintain them.
Yeah, it just was, and it was they call it a 1,000-year storm, and then Rita shows up 2 weeks later, as strong as Katrina, just about 100 miles to the west, where there's a lot less press.
Yeah, yeah. I want to ask you, before we switch to Hawaii, I want to ask you about the Brad Pitt houses. I know there's been a lot of like dumping on Brad Pitt, and I really I never go there because the way that I view it is he probably thought he was doing something helpful and he probably wanted to do good. On that same tour with the journalists, I got a tour of one of the Brad Pitt houses. And again, my reaction was very different from the journalists. But the gentleman that owned the house had a picture of him and Brad Pitt, and there was a lot of happiness and joy in the generosity that he had shown. I know those haven't worked out as intended, and it feels like there's an original green lesson in that as well. What should we think about? It's the lower eighth, right?
Yeah, lower ninth. Yeah,
lower ninth. I'm sorry. Yeah.
And I'll say this. In my opinion, I've never met Brad, but in my opinion, he had his heart in exactly the right place. But he had advisors who had architectural agendas that they were trying to push, and that their interest was pushing different types of architecture over the recovery of the people in the community. And matter of fact, there was I spent one entire afternoon with the person who was head of the entity. I forget what the name of the entity was now. It's been too long, but that was kind of overseeing the whole Make It Right. Well, maybe it was the Make It Right Foundation, or I think it was kind of a mothership, you might say. But anyhow, I was just pleading with her to consider the wisdom of building in ways that help the Pateau House survive and do well with very little impact. But she wasn't having any of it at all. And it was just like, no, we have to do something that is a showcase of the latest in design, and it just it was a total loss on my part, because I did nothing to persuade her to consider things long proven to work or work better in a storm. And so they were trying all sorts of stuff, and one of the things was a company that actually some of the new urbanists been very interested in, and also some of those on the traditional architecture side as well, of a product that infused wood with glass, with the idea being that it would never rot and all this. Well, in a perfect world, that was the case. In reality, of course, we all know what happened, and it became just a soggy, rotten mess in so many of those houses, and so the what is it, the Lindy principle, I think it's called, that
Yep.
you can judge the future of something by how long it's persisted already. That in terms of, shoes have been around for what, 3,000 years, and dating back to sandals at least, and so probably they have a long future ahead of them, and
Right. Right.
so but yeah, everything was about the new shiny, but I really firmly believe Brad's heart was in the right place. He just had advisors that advised him poorly.
When I look at what has happened in Maui, um, I'm going to draw on some lessons that I took from a trip to Kauai last year. I landed in Kauai expecting, um, naively expecting perhaps a landscape that felt more authentically Hawaiian. I recognize and I realized that there would be resorts, and that the resorts would be very Americanized. I had seen enough photos and known enough, but I thought that the villages and the other places that were not part of that tourist machine would feel more authentically Hawaiian. And I don't even know how to express what I'm trying to say there. I'm because what I actually discovered was it was very Western and very almost like Californian in terms of its development style. I did a whole podcast on this because, it's one thing to be in a California desert and run water into a ravine and catch it and have it used for agriculture. It's another thing to be on a volcanic rock and have, water running down a hillside at you every time it rains, which, by the way, it does almost every day.
Right.
I'm going to assume that, the village construction practices from 100 years ago were kind of compatible with what building on the side of a volcano, on an island would look like. But that's very different than what is there today. And I wonder if you just have some thoughts about what a respectful way to begin a rebuilding effort in a place like Maui would look like.
Yeah, and that, and I share your perception of that because I was there for Charette, oh my, 15 years ago, something like that, and
Yeah.
in the
Well,
Charette was on. Go
Steve,
ahead.
could I hate to, I'm sorry to interrupt. I had finished my thought, and then in my brain came, how do we do it? How do we rebuild in a way that is respectful to this place and the people there? But in my brain, I'm always like, I'm also like that. It does not just overlay modernity onto them. I feel like the lesson in New Orleans is that we went into a place and we imposed something on them in a way that was not authentic to them, and it has not worked as well as it should have. Is that fair? Like, am I overstating it?
Well, it's a big we, because
Right.
the we
That's fair.
being the FEMA of that day did precisely that. They had they had kind of a tunnel vision is to just simply getting the infrastructure right and getting some buildings back up that were disaster recovery buildings, and there was no thought of the economy of the place or the culture of the place or anything like that. So that was very, very accurate for the big
Well,
business, big government approach. It was
well,
not what we
how
were
do
trying to
we
do.
how do we as Americans look at, this place in Hawaii, part of our country, and respectfully, begin a rebuilding process that is not just imposing, the development pattern of California onto what is a very different ancient landscape.
One of the big problems is the fact that when a disaster occurs, then it is time is very much of the essence, because you have people who how are they going to live, and so everything is done at a very accelerated pace, and so there's not really time for that community and the government entities that descend upon them to think through what is the essence of this place and its culture and economy and so forth, and its infrastructure, meaning the urbanism and the architecture, and so stuff just gets slapped up out of the closest available model, where there might be some production to actually produce a lot of this stuff and put it on the ground. So, and that's a part of what Elsie and Wanda and I are trying to work towards, is a more resilient way of approaching disasters or recoveries of multiple sorts, so that it can take into account more things than what normally gets considered in a recovery effort. Now, I will say this, and I think that there's, similar to the way in which Seaside on its original 60 acres is slightly bigger than that now, with the cover of the back part, but on its original 60 acres basically changed the world, beginning in 1980, a little over 40 years ago now, and so and that is that a great small model has more impact than almost anything else. And so, like when Michael occurred, in Mexico Beach was wiped out, except for Dr. LeBron Lackey's house that was sitting right there at the very ocean front and had basically no damage. And people said, how is that even possible? It was the same storm. Everything around it was just demolished. In like manner, there was that one house that in Hawaii that was totally untouched by the storms, where everything around it was just burnt to cinders. And so we need to learn from these tiny little, you might say, clues or hints or snippets of wisdom, whatever you want to call it, but these tiny little things that performed exceptionally better than everything around them, into what might be some good ideas about how you build back. One thing that in my time there, 10 days or so, 15 years ago, I also saw these little towns that looked like Old West towns that were put up that would have had nothing to do with what I would have thought would have preceded them. I actually don't know what the architecture there was like and the urbanism was like, 150 years ago. I've never learned that. But what I do know is, if you're in a place that is susceptible to wildfires, and why in the world that California can't learn this, I do not know. But in a place susceptible to wildfires, your best response is to have tight urbanism built of masonry or non-flammable things that where you don't really have a lot of fuel in the town, that the fire can rage around you. But that one house, literally all its neighbors burnt down, and it didn't, because it presented very little fuel. And so, but you have and, like, for example, in Key West, when it burned 150 years ago, everybody, similar to in Hawaii, but everybody got in Hawaii, everybody just jumped in the ocean. There, everybody went down, jumped in their boats, fishing boats or whatever, and went out into the water and watched the city burn. And what they noticed is that every time that fire fell on the roof of a house that was wood shingles, the house burned down. When it fell on the roof of a house that was 5E metal, then the house did not burn. And so we've got to be able to quickly be able to say, what are the clues today of what works better than everything else that was destroyed? And so, like the Key West 5E, and then Dr. Lackey's house in Mexico Beach, and the one house in Hawaii that did not burn. We've got to get better at reading those clues quickly.
Can I say something too? Because I feel like there is something implied in what you're saying that I don't know if everybody will pick up on. And I'm gonna say it in this way, and I want you to push back if I'm not saying this correctly. It would be better if we are going to go and help people rebuild. And I think we should help people rebuild. If we're going to go there with compassion and open hearts and generosity and help people rebuild, it would be better to help someone get into, say, an 800 square foot house that was fire resistant in the way you just described than it would be to get into a 2,400 square foot house that would have a higher resale value for an Airbnb, and thus be more marketable from a mortgage-backed security standpoint. Is that a fair statement?
That is absolutely a fair statement, and it goes right to the heart of what we're trying to do with the Katrina cottages, of getting people into something that they can get a foothold on their place again, and some big corporate entities don't come in and try to buy out the whole town. There's been a lot of talk about, is that happening right now? And I don't know. I have no special insight into that. But yeah, that absolutely is the better approach. But again, that requires being able to quickly evaluate this particular place and not just say we're going to bring in the same standard tired result from somewhere else in the U.S. It might be it's not like you can necessarily build like Orlando, Florida, even and have a good result, but especially not the old West towns. Which is how, and forgive me for not saying the name of the town. My name gets really mispronounced many times. So I'm very sensitive about mispronouncing the name of another person or even another town, and I'm not confident yet that I can say the town name correctly, and so that's why I'm not. But my point is the ability to come in and quickly evaluate what actually works there and what are the clues we've been given by the disaster, instead of imposing a kind of a packaged solution, is it's hugely important. And I don't use this term a lot, but I have high regard for the principle, and that is that it requires some humility to take that approach as opposed to saying, yeah, we know everything, we're just going to drop it all on you. You see what I mean?
No, I exactly what you mean. I feel like the standard default is to say, we know, here we're going to come in and we have a formula. It's 120% of your pre-assessed home value. We've got a cadre of, engineers and planners who are going to come in and lay down zoning codes and put pipe in the ground and create American style cul-de-sacs. And we're just going to hand this back to you, as a partially finished product, but one that you're going to struggle to maintain, one that is going to come with, now everyone's going to have mortgages and high costs and a different economic situation. And to me, that's not recovery, I guess. That when I listen to you talk about Jamaica, when I listen to you talk about New Orleans, in my mind, I don't hear you saying we're going to create prosperity for you the way I define it, but I do hear you saying we're going to walk with you on a path to recovery. And when I look at what's gone on in Maui, and I look at what our response has been thus far, it feels like we are rushing to the gate to provide assistance, but it's assistance on our terms. And I'm worried, or I'm afraid that it doesn't look like recovery.
Yes, and as a matter of fact, there's another card that gets played very often, and that is to say that we are the recovery experts, as if recovery is the same everywhere for every disaster that happened, when it emphatically is not. And so becoming a recovery expert in the town of Maui is a very different thing than being a recovery expert in New Orleans or in Kingston or where you or in Marsh Harbor, any of these places that have had great disasters. You being an expert in the recovery of the one place does not make you an expert in the recovery of another place, unless they're very similar places in a very similar part of the world. Right. In that case, there may be some lessons that translate over. But that's the big corporate model, is to say that, yeah, we do this all around the world. And okay, but if you're importing importing and using the same tools in one place as a very different other place, how much success do you really expect to have with that?
Steve Mouzon, the original green. How if people want to follow you, I feel like the place that I get you the most is on Twitter, although you've been less active there lately. What are people who want to follow you? Where are they going these days?
Well, I have the originalgreen.org is my main site, and I'm rebuilding it from the ground up as I've been working over the last couple of years. So it's kind of a work in progress right now, but I've got a ton of content up there. So that's the more long-term place. And with Twitter, like for the last few weeks, for example, I've been really engrossed in a couple of very exciting work projects that have kind of taken all my time. And when I go down a rabbit hole like that, you kind of wonder, is my client looking at what I'm doing on Twitter and saying, is he really working hard enough for this project? So when I disappear for weeks on end, that's because I'm down some rabbit hole on a job that needs to get taken care of. But yeah, but Twitter is where typically you'll find me putting up new stuff most frequently, and I'm just my username is just Steve Mouzon. It's just my name with a ad at the beginning and no space in the middle.
Well, Steve Mouzon on Twitter is very accessible, so anybody who wants to chat with him, hit him up on there. He's very responsive, and maybe when you're done working on your big project, I got the same thing. I've got a book contract that is a little overdue, and every time I post a picture of my kid going to college on Twitter or on Facebook, I'm thinking, is someone at Wiley Publishing looking at me going, "What? You have a family? Stop that."
You're not allowed to have a family.
No, not when you have a book overdue.
Yeah, exactly.
All right. Thank you, friend.
Yes, sir. It's such a delight to be with you, and hope to see you soon.
Likewise. And thanks everybody for listening. Keep doing what you can to build a strong town. Take care.